Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion sessions. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Mikhail Thompson and Mr. William Lassiter here. And today we are going to continue the conversation about the tribes of the elves, the elf clans, and discuss Thingol and Melian, pick up where we left off with that, the mingling of the gods with the elves, and what does that mean? And finally, we're going to wrap up today with a discussion about Smeagol, Gollum, the destruction of the ring, and the working of Providence in the Lord of the Rings, because it is March, folks. That's right. You know what that means? March 25th coming up. That's the beginning of the new year in Aragorn's new reckoning, starting from the destruction of the ring, March 25th. I wonder why he might have picked that date. Why did Tolkien? What did he have in mind? I don't know. We'll have to find out. So, Mr. Lester, why don't you kick it off with the elf clans? We left with this wonderful chart that you found, detailing over a timeline, sort of this family tree of the different races of elves, and they're distinguished in part sort of through natural, what's the word, generation and moving apart, much like you might see. I mean, it looks for all the world like a language family tree. And here are the Indo-European languages flowing down. So sort of natural developments moving in different places to have different groups of peoples, in this case, peoples being elves. But then there are some really significant changes, or I don't want to say necessarily divisions, but sometimes it is, or conflict-based divisions. But these distinctions based on events or choices that happen in the history of Middle-earth, either, I would say, rarely solely the part of an elf, but the relationship between elf and Valar, between the elves and the Valar, different decisions they make shapes them to be a certain way, or marks a turning point where one people becomes two peoples.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, first off, the timeline that I'm working with, there are these great artists out here. We live in an age where you have people doing all this great artwork. And this one is by Emil Johansson. It's from the loaderproject.com. And it's, like you said, it is a language tree as much as it is a family tree. And we have to consider that Tolkien was right there in the middle of this development of the idea of Indo-European languages, the development of the language connections between things. And he was working himself to some degree on the Oxford Dictionary. So he was linguist par excellence. Here he is having that all in his mind. And he was adamant that language is history. So when you look at a piece of language, you're looking at the history of a people. So we see a lot of that in this tree. And I think that the artist here, Emil Johansson, does a great job of actually putting that into a visual form. First off, I just wanted, for my own clarity, but also for the clarity of anybody who is watching, this is, like I said, the place where most people get bogged down is in all the different names of the elves. The Quendi are those who speak, or those who talk. And the Valaquendi are those who are called back to Valar itself. But then you have these three divisions of the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. And on this chart, you have off to the left, you have the different events that occur that cause the different sunderings of people. And, I got to admit my ignorance. Some of the abbreviations, I'm not sure what they mean. So maybe you can help me out. It's a YT 1050. So what is the YT standing for? Do you know what that is? Because I don't.
Is that the year of the trees? Normally I would think something like third age or something, but it's not the third age yet. So it's probably the year of the trees. Because at this point, these are the elves that are being called to come and be in Valinor to behold the light of the trees. And as we discussed in the last episode, there were three, when the Valar came and said, hey, you guys should come move in with us. Essentially come over to Valinor, the land of the gods. Three of the elves went forward as emissaries to go check it out, to recon, understand what this means, find the way, and come back and make the pitch to the rest of the elves. Hey, we're all going to move. And so that's where, of course, as we discussed last time, Thingol was able to behold the light of the trees, even though the rest of his people effectively don't end up going over there. He had beheld this light and come back, because he doesn't end up making it because of Melian. We'll discuss that next. But I think it's very interesting. My guess is Year of the Trees. There was one thing I wanted to point out and before I forget it, I just noticed as you were saying it. So the Quendi means those who speak or the speakers, because they're the only beings only bodily beings endowed with speech at this point yet. But the Valaquendi, you said those that are called by the Valar. And that's literally what that means, because Quendi is going to function in the same way linguistically as it does in, say, a language in many other languages. But that Quen participle, that root word Quen, if that has to do with speaking, then Vala Quendi means those who are called by the Valar or spoken to by the Valar, because Vala would be relating to the Valar. I'm just playing philologist here and say that he probably uses the word Quendi not just to refer to the act of speaking, but also in the sense of calling. So like the Hebrew word Shem has to do with this. Shem can mean the name, it can mean calling, it can mean, hey, you listen up. Shema Israel, hey, hear all Israel, listen to me. But it can also mean the name or called by, something like that. So Hashem, the name, or Shemuel, called by God. And I think he's using Quen in a similar way. So we should see that connectivity there of not only they're endowed with speech, and that's who defines who they are. It's exactly like what you said, where Tolkien is very adamant as a professional philologist that there is no history apart from the stories, the language, the speech, and no speech stories apart from the history. So we have that level, but then there's also this vertical axis that just appears to me in the sheer naming of these peoples. The Valaquendi are those that are called by the Valar or who speak to the Valar. That this notion of speech is not only horizontal, but vertical.
But vertical
There's
too.
a way in which it elevates, or it's the means of intercourse with the divine for them, right? That's how they encounter the Valar, is they're called, they're spoken to, they're beckoned.
Now, okay, so Year of the Trees, that's good. And I'll go with that because that sounds right up the alley where I was going to. But this point about being called and also those who speak, this is a really intriguing point to me. The whole idea of language is a strange and fascinating thing. Like, why on earth do humans do it? And there's this movement right now to say, well, every animal has language. Well, sort of. I mean, they have communication, but not language.
Even though Chomsky's very clear on that. No. It's not. That's not. Science doesn't bear it up. Like Noam Chomsky famously said, you can have a kitten and you can talk at it for years and years and years, and the kitten is never going to learn how to speak. You get a human baby, you put a human baby, and you can't stop that thing from talking. Just a very relatively short period of its development, and it's using words like that. It just catches it. So there's a fundamental difference between human beings and any other organism that we're aware of.
And our ability to speak allows us to conjure up great things and great ideas and to imagine a future. It also allows us. I mean, the whole idea of God's spell, for instance, it's a good calling up, a good spell that's created. But it's also allows us to be deceptive and to depress and to demoralize whole groups of people. So language itself becomes sort of the basis of whatever it is we're talking about when we talk about magic and fantasy, later on in the Lord of the Rings and the like. So, and I would conjecture even possibly the ring itself is connected to this idea of language. I mean, I was noticing the other day when I was listening to this great performance that's done by Andy Serkis, how the letters, when they appear on the ring, that's very unusual. You don't normally have that kind of writing on a ring. You have like 1 or 2 words at the most. But to have that whole poem there on the Ring of Power sort of indicates that the ring is intrinsically tied up with language itself. I wouldn't be surprised if that's a huge portion of what goes on in Lord of the Rings later on as well. But back to this for just a minute. The whole movement of the elves is itself a movement away from danger to the safety of Valar, and they are split into these 3 groups when they're called by the brothers of Finwë and Owen Elwe. But the one character in particular who goes off the track, so to speak, gets sidetracked, Elwe, he's sidetracked. Well, they're all called by language, and he's sidetracked by beauty, which I find really kind of interesting. he's not sidetracked by an ideal or by a fear or by any kind of more important thing that he has to get done. It's this sheer draw towards something really, really, really beautiful. And I wonder, I'm not yet ready to talk about Fingal and Melian, but I wonder if there isn't something to be said about language as well. That in some ways there's another quality that occurs in human life that is inexplicable, that you can't capture it in language. So if the elves are called by language to come to Valar, the one who doesn't make it, so to speak, doesn't make it because he's called by or drawn by something even more powerful than language, which is a movement of the heart or a divine thing. To express
Right.
love is very difficult. You can't do a checklist like la 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 la. Okay, I love her. It's something which almost defies language. Testimony to all the songs and poetry that's been written about love over millions of years. Nobody has yet fully captured it. So Roberta Flack comes close, I think, with you. First time ever I saw your face. And one last thought while I'm jonesing on this. One last thought.
Mhm.
I find that the old way of expressing religion in the ancient world was through this idea of the logos. The logos being very connected to a mathematical system of thought. It was all the things of the world being a reflection of a greater and eternal mathematical truth that's intertwined like a tapestry, if you will, or a skein. And we only get dim glimpses of it here, but it was referred to as the logos. And later that, of course, is converted to the idea of in the beginning was the word, and that's synonymous with what later is the anointed one, the Xristos, the son of Joseph, Yeshua, the son of
Right.
Joseph. But in the ancient world, there was an erotic draw towards the logos, the philosophers claimed. In other words, you're drawn towards the logos by the same thing that draws you erotically to somebody else, and almost
Yes.
an aching or an emptiness. But the logos doesn't in the ancient world. The logos doesn't come down and call you directly. That only happens in the Christian world. The Christian world says the logos actually does come down. They said incarnatus est, and the logos in the Christian world draws man back to it rather than man being drawn romantically towards the beauty of the logos. So anyway, I'll conclude the thought.
Yes.
Is there a connection here between the story of Fingal and Melian and the Christian view of the logos? I guess that's how I'd frame it.
Sure. I mean, I think it's certainly compatible because with the Christian idea of the logos, and it's I mean, that's what you're pointing out is that's the unique Christian claim, is that what differentiates the religion of Christ from anything else around it or before it or since, is the claim that, okay, that logos, that Tao, the fundamental sort of law of the universe, which is, we say mathematics, it's not like the way that we do mathematics today in the modern
No,
West
not at all.
at all. We're talking something radically different. To get a nice little summary view of that, please see, oh, what's his name? Is it Herbert Spencer? No, Follow the Western World. That German guy, help me out.
You got me. Hang on a second. I'll extend my brain.
Spengler.
Spengler. Okay, Spengler.
Spengler's Fall of the Western World. He goes through this series of different, like when we say mathematics, we mean something different than even people in 16th century Europe, definitely different from, and he goes back all the way, how radically different ancient Indian subcontinent mathematics, ancient Hindu subcontinent mathematics are from Egyptian mathematics, are from Sumerian mathematics, etc. What they say they're doing when they do that. And that gets very in depth with that. Recommended source for the more literately devoted of you. But just don't become a Nazi in the process. You'll understand why.
By listening to Wagner.
Yeah, it's like listening to Wagner. Spengler's great. He's right about most things. He's a little too optimistic about this recovery of a national spirit. That's what it is. Okay, the times people live in. But I think so. So the idea then is that, for the ancient Greek or the ancient Near Easterner, this idea of the logos, and this is obviously the Greek word, as the pattern of all reality, or the Tao for the Chinese, that's mean, we're talking about the same thing. The Christian claim, and this is what John, the gospel writer John, says, okay, that Tao, that logos, yeah, that became a man, and we walked with him, and we like hung out and embraced and stuff, right? And that's really hard to comprehend. If the Tao, if you can define the Tao, then it's not the Tao, right? If that Tao somehow became like tangible and touchable, touchy-feely, it becomes very weird. But that's the claim that's the Christian claim, and therefore even more fall in lovable with, right? Even enters even more deeply into the erotic, and there's, well, I don't want to go too much down a path, but art and architecture, Christian art and architecture reflects that mystical reality of the erotic, of the divine interpenetrating with the mundane realm in ways that Dan Brown just really he's wrong, but he's wrong in like a preschooler trying to tell you about particle physics. You're wrong, but like acutely insufficient in such a vast degree. But anyhow, is it like the Christian claim? I don't think so. I think, because it's not like Melion is beauty itself incarnate, objectively speaking. But it does say something about the nature of beauty. And I think that's not, I think like I said, the Christian claim is compatible with it, but I don't think it's predicated on it or somehow it's a uniquely Christian truth, because this idea that there's something more even to the logos than what we can articulate. There's this dimension of beauty and the erotic. I mean, that's why you have these crazy Dionysian mystics. Like there's something to the divine madness, to enchantment, to fairy, that's not articulable even prior to the incarnation. And I think Tolkien, I mean, I hate to invoke a dead guy to back me up on my claims about his own work, but I think if I were to take sort of the whole of what Tolkien has to say, is that he would say, yeah, effectively that's right, because he's not creating a different world like Lewis, where you somehow have to like work in a magical talking Jesus line thing. He's Tolkien's essential claim is that this is really, really ancient prehistory of our own world. And he somehow has had privileged access into seeing that. If we bridge together all of his stuff that was the uncompleted works and the notes and marginalia, essentially that's kind of the context that he's trying to frame out, is how do you weave a story that's about an ancient prehistory. So this is all way, 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 way before Christ. It's way before our normal recorded history. In fact, at this point, we're talking before the creation of human beings. But I think it's about beauty. It's about the nature of, there's something essential otherwise about experience in the world, that beauty and the logos somehow, you have to have both. And there's something good and right and just that's drawing him aside. It's not an ideal. It's not, he's got this great philosophy. He's going to create the perfect society. So we're all going to turn aside here, folks, and this will be my land, and I'll set it up all across Utah. Sorry, folks. And we're going to do this. But he's drawn. He meets the fairy queen, and is instantly enraptured with her.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, and that it kind of shifts into the Fingal Melion story immediately, because there are two things in that story that are really striking to me. One is, as you said, the origins, the pre-Christian origins, because every time I read that story, I am reminded of the two great stories in Greek mythology, one about Orion and the other one about Actaeon. And Orion is this great hunter, and the constellation Orion, you put in the stars. But Orion was a friend of Artemis, and there are numerous stories about how Orion died. He gets poisoned, he gets shot, he attacks one of her disciples. There's even a story where he attacks her. He's overcome with desire for her and attacks her, and she kills him. But one way or the other, Orion gets killed and is placed in the stars. But it's almost like the two stories overlap, of Orion and Actaeon. Actaeon is the one that we actually see more explicitly drawn out in places like Ovid, and Actaeon was a hunter, a human hunter, who comes across Artemis in her bath and in the middle of the woods, and he's overcome with desire and love for her, and he stands there just transfixed. And then she turns him into a deer and sets his dogs on him, and they tear him to pieces. Which everybody interprets that norm as like, oh, Artemis is just this terrible witch with a bee, and she would do this terrible thing to humans, which isn't exactly the message I think that you're supposed to get from the story. I think the message from the story is that he himself becomes the sacrificial victim. He becomes he's overcome with this desire, which fractions him from his mortality, and so he enters into the natural world almost directly. And those two stories taken together always seem to me to be something that Tolkien was kind of playing with when he does the story of Thingol Melian. But both those stories also are stories about being drawn towards the beauty of the natural world, the pattern of the world, the beauty of the logos, whatever you want to call it. Very stories about Eros and stories about being taken off your path, so to speak, by that erotic drawl. So I agree with you that I don't think that this is a Christian story, so to speak. And I really, really am careful that we don't fall into allegory, because I know that Tolkien hated allegory and he wasn't trying to make allegory, and we can't make an identity between the Christ, for instance, and Melian or something like that. But it's almost like the story of the Logos coming down to earth, and the attraction towards the Logos and all. It follows a pattern that was set down before. It follows a pattern almost that was more eternal than we immediately have knowledge of. And that pattern seems to be the pattern that you're describing, which is a draw towards, you could call it an erotic, but a love draw towards the beautiful and the good and the true, seems to me.
And I think that's right. And that's what occurs to me, as you know, in this, is that may be that essentially, I think that's why in many ancient societies, and I would say, I mean, societies of antiquity, some that persist to this day, their primary mode of doing philosophy, let's call it, which means love of wisdom. Now it's philos, not eros in that sense, but philosophy, their way of grappling with ideas and a view of the world is not to grapple with ideas in a prosaic textual sort of way, but to write poetry and song. And I think I would posit also, and here's just a little bug trail to follow at some point, things like, I mean, I think ancient like prehistoric architecture might also be relevant of that, like cave paintings, maybe even things like Stonehenge standing stones, may be more connected with creating a beautiful, working out in the aesthetic realm notions of the cosmos. I mean, in fact, effectively, that's what, even as it dawns on me, that's precisely what the premise is of Moses spending 40 days and 40 nights up on the mountain, coming down, and that whole book of Leviticus, Numbers, last part of Exodus, where we're looking at, okay, and here's how the temple is going to be laid out, and the tent has to be here, and then the cloth has to be made of this stuff. It's all really boring, but the basic premise, and this is the way that the ancients understood it, a lot of the desert mystics are commenting on this, is that when you lay it all out, and they have the time to do that, he's working out. We have the construction manual, the Lego set instructions on how to put this thing together. But what it is that he's trying to work out then in the physical space meditations on the divine nature of the cosmos and the layout of the cosmos. He's saying, okay, I've seen the heavens. Now here's what we're going to do as a scale model, essentially. And I think that's all of the same piece. But I think fundamentally that's to say the aesthetical working out of the big questions rather than a logical or rhetorical working out of the big questions. I mean, you see that Homer doing this too, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of Odyssey, right?
Yep, absolutely. And Schwala de Lubitz has a really good point in his book, The Temple and Man, where he says that our modern conception of temples and churches is totally off from what the ancients have. We see the temple and the church now as a sort of functionary thing. It's almost like just a building to keep the rain off or something. But the ancients didn't see it as that. They saw it as a converting instrument, a converting piece of artwork that actually changes a person as you move deeper into the temple. From the narthex to the the actual place of worship, the Holy of Holies. And all the things on the walls, all the things in the stained glass, all that was not just there for decoration. It was part of the process of changing the soul. And the changing of the soul, Lubitz says, is that it changes the soul so that it begins to see clearly the connection between heaven and earth. That's the point. And if you walk out of there thinking, okay, now we get donuts, then you've lost the point. You know, it didn't have purchase on you. But that same kind of architecture happens in beautiful artwork to a certain degree. You know, when you see a piece of drama or you read a piece of poetry that's absolutely satisfying, it's as though the thing is converting you to see the world in a different way. The Gospel of John, for instance, that we referenced earlier, you know, the language of it is so beautiful, but the structure is chiasmatic. It's designed to be balanced one side to the other. I was fascinated to see that the shortest passage in John is Jesus wept, 2 words, and it's right smack dab in the center of the entire script. So if you laid out the script word for word on either side of this, the very center, the linchpin would be Jesus, the divine element, and weeping, which is a mortal experience, on either sides of that sentence, which I think is so brilliant as to be mind blowing. That John was thinking about every single word in his gospel. He wasn't just writing down history; he was creating a converting tool. He was converting piece of artwork. And I think that what it does is it draws us through the draw to beauty to see the world as something that we want to linger with, we want to remain with. And that's why when you do see a piece of drama that's brilliant, like I just saw Dune, right? You know, you see a piece of drama that's brilliant, or you read a poem, or you're engrossed in a novel, a Jane Austen novel or something, time stops. It just ceases. Like you can get wrapped up in the thing and people are like throwing paper wads at you and you don't even notice, you know, calling you to dinner and you're like, okay, 1 minute. um, that's that's what the process is like. You are enraptured in the same way that the great ecstasy of Saint Teresa statue. You know, you're. I'm with my book. You know?
Yeah.
Saint Teresa,
Good
and
book.
that's why I think this. That's why. Yeah, you're telling me, buddy. That's why I think this image of Fingal and Melian is it's not Christian. I agree with you, but it's like it's setting up the pattern for that very experience later on of rapture or ecstasy of standing outside the body and having time stop in the middle of the woods. You stand there gazing into the eyes of this goddess. You know, he actually all the elves are on the way to see the Valar. He actually meets one of them, you know. I mean, she's a Maiar, I think, but he actually meets one and joins with her and marries her, you know, and makes a family with her.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's a very interesting thing, is that he's drawn aside. You say, oh no, he's drawn aside, he's gone astray. But he's still meeting a goddess. He's still meeting one of them
Yeah,
up there. I mean, it's not a
yeah,
Valar, but what do the categories mean in that sense? I mean, we've got this penchant for trying to categorize things, you know, welcome to modernity, but it's just not there
yeah.
historically. They don't care so much about categorizing the same way we think about categorizing. Um, and but yeah, so she's a divine being, right? We'll say that
Yeah.
because we have such a narrow conception of, well, is it a god or not a god? Who cares? You know, who cares? It's just not. It doesn't enter into it. But
Totally an
she's a
archangel.
divine being, and he falls in love with this divine, and they're on their way to go see the other divine beings in the home of the divine beings. And you're talking of setting up a pattern. I mean, so here's an interesting element though. So he meets with Melian, and you've got, so there's 2 things, I think, two tracks to go down here. One is the mingling then of divinity with the humanity, or in this case obviously
Yes.
elves, but with, you know, mortal by comparison, you know,
Right.
limited, you know, non non-eternal creature, right? Limited finite
Right.
critter, with the divine, mingling of bloodlines, which is also not uncommon. I mean, look at the whole line of Julius Caesar, right? They're descended from Venus, right? That's the claim, right? I mean, that's you know, you've got, you know, some us who we are, and that figures into so many different people's tales and stories.
Yes.
And okay, so that's there. So that's a thing. Why is that here? So one aspect aspect is the mingling of the divinity with the ordinary, but then in a way that it's not just singular, like you said, they make a family together. But then it's also a pattern that's repeated down the line, chronologically and ontological hierarchy. So a divine being mingles with Elwe Singolo, who becomes Thingol, right? Melian and Elwe Singolo, they wed and they have a child. That child is Luthien. She's a semi-divine elvish being, right? So she then mingles with a mortal man, Beor. No, not Beor. That's somebody else. Baron. Baron the one-handed. My syllables all get mixed up. English is such a funny language. Baron the one-handed, right? So Baron, a mortal man, and it's not just some sort of like family tradition, getting married and making more half-breed type of things. And again, anybody who criticizes Tolkien for being a racist has never read Tolkien. There is mingling going on left and right, and goodness knows, cats and dogs are living together.
That's right.
There, yeah.
Pure chaos.
Even hobbits have fairy blood. It's just, Anyway.
Yeah.
So you've got this divine being. What's the pattern? Elwe goes into the woods and he sees the divine being and he's raptured with her. And eventually they wed. Then you've got Beren, a man, goes into the woods and he hears the singing like a nightingale, Luthien, Tinuviel he calls her, and he sees her and he's raptured with her. And eventually, after many adventures and having to win her father's favor and so on and so forth, they wed and they mingle and they produce an heir. And they have children, they have a child. Down the line all the way, and there's other elf human pairings in that line, but we're talking about the pattern of the plot line. Man goes in, mortal or relatively mortal creature sees divine or relatively divine being in the woods, enraptured, things transform, and it's a major plot twist for the history of the world. Elwe and Melian, Beren and Luthien, and then all the way down the line to Aragorn, essentially an orphan, basically, raised in Rivendell, man, who's descended of a long line of man coming back to this man-elf and then elf-god thing. So because he's a direct descendant, he wanders in the woods and beholds a new Luthien Tinuviel. That's Arwen, Evensword, right? So same thing, enraptured, and after many adventures, he has to go and he plays his own part in defeating Sauron, just as Beren plays his own part in defeating Morgoth. And he all of a sudden gets to wed Arwen, and they mingle and sort of rejoin again elfness and elfity and humanity. I mean, how do you call elvenness and humanity?
Yeah.
But that pattern is then repeated, and that's a replicable pattern that's set. I mean, so it's 3 data points. You've got a trend, and the idea is that if this is ancient history too, this is also trying to set up. Okay, so here's a pattern that we can find repeated in history, and we can apply it. The applicability of this kind of pattern in many different ways in human history and in our own lives and in our interpretation of our stories, which maybe all amounts to the same thing.
Yes, and if I remember right, the story of Luthien, Tinuviel, and Beren is retold by Aragorn with this sort of delight and joy, and almost like I can't help myself, but I'm repeating the pattern, And I think all that's done, if I remember right, on Weathertop to the hobbits. He tells it just before the attack by the Nazgul, which is serendipitous,
Exactly.
But it's intriguing to me too that in those pairings you have this great joy that draws the men in the case of Aragorn and in the case of Thingol, draws the men aside from some other thing that they were going to do something almost greater than that, which is to make a life with this beautiful individual, this beautiful nightingale or what have you. And I remember hearing somewhere or some podcast, I listen to so many, where they talk solely about the sorrow and the misery that comes afterwards, because one of the partners dies. And so the one who is without the partner has to live on in misery. And I thought, well, but that's not really the point. I mean, if one were to avoid this kind of eros because of the misery, you'd be missing the entire point of the story.
Well, that's true too, but it only holds. But that that's only true of Arwen and Aragorn.
Hmm.
And well, even there, it's not entirely true. I mean, so with Arwen and Aragorn, I think you can make that case, but you miss the whole setup that she becomes a human being. Essentially, she assumes a mortal fate. And in Tolkien's world, men don't die; they're taken out of the world. I mean, they die. That's how you're taken out of the world for some greater special purpose that only Iluvatar knows. The elves
Hmm.
kind of are stuck in this perpetual,
Yes.
wandering around the mandala. They don't get to blow away with the
Yes.
wind and become
Yes.
something else. Um,
Tolkien says they're
so she's
natural rather than
elevated that
supernatural.
exactly as we were saying last episode. Um, but for Baron and Luthien, there's not that's not how that plays. That's actually not how that story goes.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, he dies, he gets killed. That's it. He dies. He kicks it, and the gods send him back. They say,
Hmm.
well done, sir. We don't even know what to do with you at this point. Well, you go back because she's going to die of grief. And they're like, no, 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 this story's too good to end here. We want it to play out. And they come back to life basically and have a child, and then they live in like eremitical solitude on some island
Hmm.
as like this divinely, I mean, equivalent to monastic in the sense that they live on an island off the shore in their own sort of little enchanted realm for hundreds and
Hmm.
hundreds of years. They live out their days in peace and happiness, uh,
Yeah.
um, and until they eventually fade from the world in some mystical way. I mean, they go like Enoch or Elijah. They're just kind of taken up. Um,
Or like the
and
Virgin
then for
Mary, the
Thingol and
Dormition.
Melion, I mean, they're still living in Valinor at this point. They're there. If you
Mm.
if you could get there now across the bent seas, you'd see them. I mean, there's no
Hmm.
there's no misery ending with them either. And I don't think there's any case at all really to take that sort of claim seriously. I think that
Yeah.
interpretation is totally bunkus.
Well, I think it's also bunk, and you're right. And it's also bunkus because the whole point of the thing is that the whole of her future is laid out for her, for Arwen, when she is faced with this choice of staying with Aragorn or not. The whole future is laid out with her, and she makes a choice. It's not like she
Mm-hmm.
chooses this thing without knowing what's going to happen. She makes a conscious choice. I have been an elf, but I love this man so much that I'm going to sacrifice that elf future for a long human mortal future, which makes it highly
Mm-hmm.
romantic and highly not tragic. It's not tragic. It's highly romantic and powerful. And talk about strong female characters. I mean, gosh, to make that decision, knowing everything that's going to come, it really reminds me a great deal of there's an image out of the movie Arrival where the aliens come down, blah blah blah. But the woman is faced with this future with the daughter who's going to have a debilitating and terminal disease, and she chooses to have the baby anyway. It's knowing the pain that that's going to cause. Because I think what Tolkien was saying, what the movie Arrival is saying, is that the love of that relationship greatly outweighs even the length of sorrow that you're going to experience later on. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's true, and that's oh, well, he's been taken from among us. That's all I can say at this point. Is that well, we may see a repeating pattern, something looking back to say, well, this is just another one of those. Or if we begin at the beginning with the Silmarillion and we look forward and say, okay, well, here's the thing, and then they're just it's just copycatting. Baron Luthien, that's just a repetition of family patterns, something like that. We miss the perspective of the Valar, who actually sang all of this into being to begin with. They beheld the pattern in the mind of Iluvatar, and then they sang it into existence. Um, and they sang it into existence. And so they've seen it. It's already played out. Remember, that's the basic sort of meta premise of the whole history of Middle Earth, is that it's already been played out. It's already been played out, and the it all happens sort of at once. Then you see, and that's the working of Providence, is that he's already here, and that's what we have is this pattern. What looks to us is like a repeating pattern if we're looking back, or if we're looking forward from Thingol's point of view, we just say, oh, well, they're just copycatting the Thingol thing, you know? But we miss the point that the Valar sang all of this into creation. They saw the pattern in the mind of Iluvatar. They said, hey, this is cool. And then we're going to play it out, and they enter into the song. But they've already seen the sheet music. They know how the plot goes. And so it's all already, in some ways, all of this, from Thingol and Melian to Beren and Luthien, all the way down thousands and thousands of years later to Aragorn and Arwen, has already happened in a certain and qualified sense from the outside of time perspective. Yeah. It's all already laid out right there. And so we really do see a mandala, and that's what the providence is in the story. That's what providence is in the story, and that sets up. So in many ways, you know, why does Thingol wander off? It's not a chance happening. It's not something he just does of his own volition, and somehow is a deviation. Why is it not a deviation from the divine will? Because it's written into the pattern so that these other things can happen as well. You couldn't have Luthien and Beren if Thingol and Melian had not mingled. You got to have the Thingol mingle, or you don't have the Springle ring. I mean, ultimately, you got to have the Thingol mingle. You don't get the Springle ring because there's no Shire, no Hobbiton, with everybody dancing around. If all that didn't happen at some point to set this up, like that's how these little tiny things all throughout provide the way. Like every pebble in a stream contributes to the flow of the water to the sea.
And now let's take that one step further here, because we have to also recognize that by the mingling of Thingol and Melian, we get by generations the house of Elrond and Elroth, who are the sons of Erendil and Elwing. And the Elroth gives sire to the kings of Numenor, if I'm understanding it right. And the kings of Numenor, the kings of Numenor, 9 of them get rings from Sauron at some point. And it's the kings of Numenor, who are elvish men elves, become the Nazgul. And so as much as we have this beautiful pattern that's set out and this beautiful romance that's occurring, not just between Thingol and Melian, but between Arwen and Aragorn and others in the family tree, we also have in the family tree I don't want to say creation, the existence of the Nazgul, the existence of the Numenor that become Nazgul, and the Numenor that try to make war on the lands of the Valar later on, and then that causes the whole inundation that occurs. You know, so it's almost like in the midst of the jelly beans, there's also these black jelly beans. You know, these licorice tasting jelly beans that are sour, they're dark. Where I was going with that was that they suffer corruption because of the rings, and they're human beings. And so there's a sense that there's no redemption for the Nazgul. I mean, it's not like you can just like send them to therapy or something, you know, have Nazgul anonymous meetings. Anonymous. Hi, I'm a Nazgul, but I can't change.
Yeah.
But it's they can't change, and elves. I don't know if we have any examples of elves that are corrupted and then revivified or rechanged or whatever.
I mean, gone like make bad choices and come back from the brink. Yeah. You know, I mean that's a thing. Some of the sons of Fëanor.
But they don't get warped in the same way Nazgul do, or
it's
Smeagol.
Not the same. And I think that's well, Smeagol's a funny case. And I think we should talk about that.
Yeah, right. That's where I was nudging. I was nudging that way.
Right.
Edging my way towards
I've been behaviorally psychologized.
Let's talk more about Smeagol.
That's right.
Because here, I guess what I was going to set up was that
Uh-huh.
the other day I was listening to that Andy Serkis
Yeah.
presentation of the Lord of the Rings, and in that the substance of the shadow, where Gandalf was talking about what happens to Smeagol. I've read the Lord of the Rings, more than 24 times, and this time around, you always see new things, and this time around, I noticed when Smeagol goes under the earth, he hides from everybody. It's a death. He becomes entombed in the earth, in the stone.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Bilbo finds the ring, Smeagol follows him out. Gollum follows him out, and it's like a resurrection in a way. And you can say it's a sort of a perverse form of resurrection, but it's a resurrection. He does follow his own little sun, right? His own little circular sun, and that draws him out of this world of death, which is under the mountain. And then he goes and pursues the ring, and during the course of that, he has a moment of actually feeling affection and care and respect for another living being for the first time in his life. That's never happened before. Smeagol has never experienced kindness or affection for other people. He's always been more interior focused and narcissistic. So for the first time, he's brought out of himself as well as brought out of from under the mountains. So there's a sort of Lazarus type action going on where the dead are revivified. And of course, that's spoiled by Sam, who says, "Here, what are you doing falling at my master?" And that's where he flips and becomes back to Gollum again. And yes, he betrays them to Shelob, and yes, he attacks Frodo at the end, and you could say he dies still somewhat monstrous. But I never thought about it before that Gollum plays this really pivotal role in the destruction of the ring. It's like he couldn't die any other way. He was unified with the ring, and so he had to perish when the ring perished. And in doing so, he ends up being the character that defeats the all-powerful Lord of Darkness, the Sauron, not Frodo. Frodo doesn't defeat Sauron. Gollum does. Smeagol does. And that led me to think about whether or not there is redemption or salvation for Smeagol. And that's where I was going with the non-school business and even with the elves. Is there, do you think, redemption for the Gollum character in Lord of the Rings?
Yeah. I mean, we see the beginnings of this rehumanizing of him in that he's already had the Smeagol Gollum thing. He's now Smeagol. He's not referring to himself as, in the third person or whatever. Second, he's not just, yes, it's us, precious, talking to himself as much. And there's that moment of tenderness, and that awakens us. And I think that's important literarily too, for us to see, in case we missed the subtle illusions, all subtleties taken away at that moment. There really is that tenderness. There's being, for the less astute, less particularly detail focused among us, all throughout the Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, Lord of the Rings, there have been subtle hints and explicit comments made, as side remarks throughout, that really indicate that Smeagol is, if not a direct ascendant of Frodo, at least a close kinsman. That is specifically within the Brandybucks, going back, river-dwelling hobbits, even before when they dwelled on the other side of the mountain, and so on and so forth, that there is this really deep connection. So in addition to sort of the shadow self that's been tracking him, first Bilbo and then Frodo, there is actually a way in which there's that continuity across generations, across time, where Smeagol's living in him. That's why there's this particular rapport between the two, not merely because they're both hobbits who have worn the ring, and Frodo sort of can sympathize and understand, but there's a syntonicity between the two of them that connects
almost like actual bloodlines, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Actual bloodlines.
Yeah. And so we see that. I think that so there's this connection that's there. And yes, Smeagol does turn and betray them to Shelob, but almost it's put pretty poignantly as precipitated by Sam's bullish attitude. Sam just cannot see any possibility of redemption for Gollum, for Smeagol, and sort of brings about their own troubles. And they all, well, there's a lot of other things that could get very psychoanalytical, themselves passing through caverns together, and so on. But I think, at the end, we see at the end of Smeagol's life, he at the end goes up, or rather, Sam shows up. Frodo says, "No, I'm not going to do it." Except he's not just backing away; he's become proud. He becomes like this man, like this son of man, glowing like fiery bronze. Here he is, and I'm going to take it. It's mine, and he puts it on his finger. And then several things happen at once. The text tells us. Well, Smeagol wrestles it from him, and really, like you said, completes the act. Now, there's a way in which we can read that as him attacking Frodo to steal the ring at the end. But there's also, there's certain questions that should come to mind, I think, that wouldn't have served if Frodo was going to throw the ring into the fire. That's when Gollum would have attacked, right? That he could just as easily have attacked him then as when Frodo says, "No, I'm not going to destroy the precious. I'll take it for myself." Certainly that too is going to provoke a reaction from Gollum. But you're right in that I'm not saying Smeagol's a hero in the sense, he's this he's a model of virtue. No, but he takes the ring. He's the one who destroys Middle-earth. He's the one who actually defeats Sauron. I mean, he's enslaved to Sauron. He's been tortured by Sauron. He's really deeply enmeshed with the dark power. The only reason he is what he is today is because the ring has made him that way, along with his cooperation. He's a malicious person to begin with, but he throws himself into the fire and is the one that really, if you want to take a sort of a Christological approach to soteriology, he's the one who actually then takes death down with him. It's Smeagol, not Frodo, that does this. Frodo pays a cost. He takes his hand, his finger, less than my shop teacher did anyway. But I mean, like, he just loses a finger, and but it's Smeagol who goes down, and after that, Sam essentially says, "Well, good riddance to bad rubbish. Thank God." And Frodo says, "No, well, hold on. Frodo says there was, and I tried pulling up the text. I don't have it explicitly in front of me. But Frodo, and this is one of those things I noticed in the most recent reading of it, is that Frodo says, "No," he says, "No, Sam, I think you misunderstand Smeagol. Like, you deeply misunderstand him." And he, and effectively says, in so many words, he did what I could not do. At the end, I could not throw it in. I couldn't part with it. But Smeagol was there to finish the job. Even Gandalf said maybe he has a role to play at the end. And Frodo seems to indicate that it's, at least in his intuition, contrary to what the reader might immediately excuse as, Gollum plays his role unwittingly in some ways, right? Despite himself, he accomplishes the task. But I think that would be to put Gollum in the role of like a cue ball on God's giant, billiards board, and he knocks it over. He knocks the ring in because the fates pushed him. All right, now it's solved. Deus ex machina comes in, grabs Gollum, throws him into the fire. God came in and solved the problem for you because Frodo couldn't do it. This guy goes in and do it. But that's not consistent with the way Tolkien constructs his world. His world is very much, every fiber of everything weaves this providence, weaves this great mandala towards things. I think if we take an understanding of Tolkien's sort of deeper magic of the way that his universe works, that he's created in there. Obviously, this is Tolkien's idea that this is how the real universe actually works, and God, the way that God created it, is that these fibers, these threads, all are twitching towards some end, because it's a song that's already been sung. The whole history, which means also unto our day, right? Because we're all part of the same world. It's just this was really long ago. The Valar have already sung this. or the Ainu, right? They've already sung the whole story of creation from beginning to end. And now they enter into it. So there's chronological time that we're tracking along with it, but it's all already a done fact. And in some ways, you might say that's the end of the scheme of Smeagol from the very get-go, and finding that thing in the river was to bring the course to completion. Moreover, when we look back at the Council of Elrond, when Bilbo says, I see what you're all about. Bilbo Baggins started this affair. Bilbo Baggins might as well finish it. And Gandalf said, sit down, old man. If it might be expected, you're right, it might be expected of you to bring it to an end if you can claim to have begun it, right? But that thing, this is a story that goes long before you picked this thing up in under the Misty Mountains. But Smeagol did kind of begin it. If we think about it, Smeagol is the first one to touch the ring since Isildur, who really only had it temporarily from Sauron. Smeagol didn't begin the affair anyway. It's kind of nobody did. Like, it's too many hands have been in that pond. But if anybody began it within the narrative of the story, it's Smeagol who then actually brings it to completion, which there's this sort of fittingness as far as a good fairy story, where he begins it and he ends it. And in that way, I think that is a redemption of Smeagol, right? He brings to conclusion. There's a perfection of the justice of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that Tolkien talked about the Silmarillion being the greater work and wanting to write that sequel that never came off. But honestly, I find myself, the whole thrust of the story goes to the cracks of doom there, the Rodruin. And it's, for me, it's really everything from the beginning of the Song of Ilúvatar in the Silmarillion, all the way to Lord of the Rings, focuses on that point of Smeagol dropping the ring in the fire. And there's an interesting connection that we made earlier between the Ring of Doom that Gollum drops into the fire, and the Ring of Doom, which is the Valar's Ring of Judgment, which itself even connects to a greater, like, metaphysical ring, if you will, the Council of the Ainur originally. So it's like these concentric rings that narrow down to that destruction of the ring in the world by Gollum. So it really does kind of point to, or narrow to, or crescendo to that moment. Gandalf says in the Substance of the Shadow, he does say that Bilbo, being away from the ring for a while, has the potential of recovering, of getting healthy again. And by extension, of course, Frodo and Gollum too. Hobbits have an interesting physiognomy different from men or elves. They seem to be able to endure a great deal of pain and torment that humans can't really do. And I think because of that, there is some evidence to say that that Gollum was recovering, or could recover, at least to some degree, given enough time. There's a point when they're on the march through Mordor, and Gollum says to Frodo, "The ring is very heavy. Gollum knows. Let Gollum carry it for master for a little while." And I've always taken that to be sort of like a conniving trick to get back the ring, and it probably was. But there might also be a thread of truth in it to some degree, in the sense that Gollum still might have strands of compassion and recognize that this is pretty heavy for other people.
Exactly.
I noticed even this morning, and I'll wrap up my little thing here. I noticed even this morning that when they're going towards Farmer Maggot's land, and Frodo is debating whether or not to bring his friends along with him, or whether the danger is too much. And he says in his interior conversation, he says, "No, this burden is too much for anybody else. It is mine. It is my burden. I inherited it. I need to do it by myself." And I think that that's a lie. I think that's the lie that is part of this whole ring imagery, which is the sense of pride that somehow we have to do everything on our own. We shouldn't allow others to be burdened by it, or to help us carry the cross at all. So you see that same kind of lie playing out when Gollum says, "I know that the ring is heavy. Let me carry it for you." He's deceiving himself in that he can actually carry the ring without going off and becoming Gollum again. But there is this noble element in Gollum when he says that, just as there's a noble element in Frodo when he says, "I don't want my friends to come along, because this is my burden. It's my own, my precious," you could say. It's my precious duty to suffer like a martyr, because that's what God wants. And
Yeah.
so Gollum there is, I think, expressing something that Frodo expresses early on, even if it is in a twisted, warped, small way, it still
Mhm.
has echoes or strands of that compassion, which indicates that it's still there, it's still in him, even to the point of wanting. I mean, I don't think at the cracks of doom, I don't think he's like, I will nobly sacrifice myself so Frodo doesn't die. I don't think it's that. It's pretty obvious. He's just wanting to get the ring. But one could construe it to a certain degree as relieving the master of his burden, and taking
Right.
the burden on himself.
Exactly right. And I think I mean, that's frankly the spin that Frodo gives to it at the end of it. I
Hmm,
mean, so if so you say, okay, well, there's at best mixed motives on the part of Smeagol. That's exactly true of Frodo earlier on in the
mhm,
story. There's
mhm,
nothing, I hazard to say, there's nothing that you can say of Smeagol's relationship with the ring, his mixed motives, his sort of twisted, warped view of reality that isn't also true of Frodo and in parts and in some places Bilbo,
mhm.
um, though to a sometimes much, much, much lesser degree
Yeah.
in the case of Frodo than in Smeagol, but it's of the same kind of thing, and it's a difference of degree only, not
Hmm,
of kind. And so
mhm.
if Bilbo and certainly Frodo are redeemable, or Bilbo's redeemable, and can be sort of over time, this and Gandalf says earlier on somewhere, Smeagol given time maybe actually could come around. I mean, look at Bilbo.
Mhm, mhm,
Is
mhm,
it going to take a lot longer therapy for Smeagol
mhm.
to come back? Because he had it for that much longer. But Gandalf explains to Frodo very clearly, it's just a matter of the fact that Smeagol had the ring that much longer. And
Yeah,
this is what Frodo says at the end. I did finally find the text here.
yeah.
Um, uh, okay, so your poor hand, said Sam. Right, I've nothing to bind it with or comfort it. I would have spared him a whole hand, or mine rather. I would have spared him a whole hand, or mine rather. That's the thing. I'd have smacked Gollum. Is essentially what he's saying there. But he's gone now beyond recall, gone forever. Ah, yes, said Frodo. But do you remember Gandalf's words? Even Gollum may have something yet to do. But for him, Sam, I could not have destroyed the ring. The quest would have been in vain, even at the bitter end. So let us forgive him, for the quest is achieved, and now all is over. So
Mhm,
Frodo says, let us forgive him. So
mhm, mhm,
all
mhm.
that Smeagol did, in some ways, it too has perished in fire and been
Mhm.
purged, literally purified, right, made into fire. Um,
And I
no, I'm
think
not
that I
saying,
think
and I think, I
I
mean,
think the
this is,
common reading, the
yeah,
common reading is that, oh, isn't that noble of Frodo to forgive him? Frodo's so noble and all this. But
mhm,
I think maybe you could read it as more Frodo recognizing the reality of the fact that he's incapable of doing this. But the only one that
mhm.
could do it was a Gollum in the
Right,
end.
right. Somebody who's lost so much of everything.
Yeah,
Gollum at
yeah.
this point, and we saw it very clearly, like in the marshes and everything, he's this craven creature. He just wants to touch it one less. He has no pretension. Nowhere do we see Gollum having pretensions of power. Oh, I'm going to snatch it. I'm going to put it on, and then I'm going to give him what for. I'm going to go back and I'm going to
Mhm.
smack Aragorn around. We don't see that. Insofar as we're given an insight into the inner workings of the Smeagol Gollum, thing, which actually is something I think I can't credit Jackson. That's all Andy Serkis. The two things that bifurcated conversation famously in the film. It displays very well. But in that moment where he's having this tender moment, he sees two young hobbits, and it's like it clicks for him. It connects him with the younger self back when the sun shone on his face.
Hmm.
This
Mhm,
love between two
mhm,
friends, and he has this. I mean, it's almost like, I mean, it is. He's described as an old man,
mhm.
uh, and it's like an old man looking, and he's all of a sudden reaching out to touch the two little children. He sees peacefully. So, like after all this, all the sorrow and the pain, and he's got a moment of lucidity there.
Mhm.
Um, and we shouldn't take that for granted and say then he made the irrevocable choice and is not redeemable anymore. But that shows that there is this deep hobbitness, humanity, right? This deep humanity underneath. And yes, it's mixed. Yes, it's perverted and it's poisoned by all these other things. But there's two ways of seeing the world. And one is that all of that is that person, primarily the poison and the perversion, all of that. That's what defines Smeagol. The other way is saying, the difference between good and evil cuts right through the center of every human heart. You look at the thing in a much more Dostoevskian kind of turn and less of a Milton, there's black and there's white, and there's Puritan, there's good and bad and whatever. But you look at it with the nuance of say, Dostoevsky, they say this is everybody's messy, just to different greater or lesser degrees and in perhaps different ways. But if Smeagol's not redeemable, then neither are any of us. And if any of us have any hope, then so does Smeagol. And we've in the West, we've got this puritanical notion of what a saint must be, right? A saint is a model of virtues. The holy person has to somehow be perfect and impeccable their entire life. You're going to scroll through all the writings, make sure they never say anything heretical. We're going to check out all the relationships, make sure they're all right. It's very different from, and I mean, this isn't just like different ethnic mindsets, but Dostoevsky sort of primes the mind to say, the Russian approach to saints. You look at the early Russian saints, but you see this also in the West, in the early dates, the early centuries of Christianity in the West too, same kind of thing. The idea that you've got some of these really brutal barbarians doing brutal barbarian things in the way that you imagine in all the movies and stories. And that's Saint Hildroth, and that's Saint Vladimir, and that's Saint, Saint whomever it is. And there's, gosh, I can't think of, Saint Olga or something, and it's not Olga, it's a different saint. This she was widowed and then became like a pagan, right? And at some point she becomes a Christian, but then decides she's going to stay a virgin, and then these suitors of these other chieftains roundabout come to try and wed her, and she says no, but they come anyway. And so she devises a trick, and eventually brutally tortures them, has them, skinned and buried in sand and eaten by fire ants. I don't like that kind of stuff. And that's the story of Saint,
Saint such and such. Yes,
exactly. Because and that's not seen as funny, ironic, or incompatible. Because what is it that fundamentally makes a saint? Well, somebody who's been imbued with the fire of God. And that's like that, and that transforms everything in their past life. Because if you're not looking at it a linear sequential timeline, but looking at time as this holistic thing, then it's how they finish out, how the last drop in the sort of the chemical vat changes the magic the colors and everything in the magic cauldron or whatever it is. I think there's some element of that, like viewing a life in that perspective, different from an accountant's perspective of making sure that all your debts and balances is done. Now, I'm not saying that Gollum was filled with the divine fire or anything like that, but if we can at least scale that, he became fire.
He became the divine fire, or the fire anyway.
He became the fire, and the fire that destroyed the ring. There's a sense in which he's carrying atoms, and to look at it that way, I mean, if just from the anthropological idea, is that he's carrying original sin with him. He's carrying the fault of Adam. He's carrying all of this wound, this original wound, and he's burying that in the fire with him. He's taking that to bury it into the fire. Does he have mixed motives in doing so? Sure, absolutely. Frodo had mixed motives too, and the perversion won out for him.
Yep. Yeah, and that in that sense, Gollum becomes the sacrifice, that makes it all possible. There's two points in that scene too that I find I've always been a little puzzled by. One is that he does a little dance once he gets the ring, and he's dancing. He dances uncontrollably into the fire. And the dance is one of joy. He's gotten back the one thing that has made him joyful the whole time. And it's at that moment that, if you want to put it this way, that God decides to take him, is at the moment when he is joyful, not when he's miserable, but when he's joyful and in the middle of this ecstatic dance. That's a very Eastern, I have to say, image, the wild dance, the Suffolk dance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's like Yeats's poem, saints that dance within the holy fire, come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. it's like that. Now, it is like, this is a strange thing about this character in this image, is that he's not this pious, holy, noble, virtuous, honorable, selfless saint,
Right.
but he does all the activities of the ecstatic Sufic saint when he's dancing. And it's at that moment that he then joins back with the primordial fire. For the longest time, and this is my own black and white thinking, for the longest time, I thought the fires of Orodruin are evil fires. And of course, they're depicted that way in the Jackson movie and many other pieces of artwork. But technically, they're not. Technically, they're just fires.
It's
It's
sometimes a fire.
primordial
It's a fire.
And I don't think Sauron started the fire. It was always burning since the world was turning.
That's exactly right.
So he really becomes part of that primordial thing that was there at the beginning of the universe: fire and water and earth and air, and he joins with it.
In
So
fact, that comes back round to Aule, right? We were talking about not too many episodes ago, where he's in charge of metal smithing, the fires of the earth, the forge, the great mountains. All of that is actually then under his domain. It's extension of his body, as it were. And yes, that part of has been twisted and warped to the purposes of Sauron. Actually, it hasn't even been warped. It's just been utilized for Sauron to put his dirty stuff on. But the fire is just fire. I think you're exactly right. It's the primordial fires. And that Sauron has used it for evil does not make it itself evil.
Right. Any more than dragon fire is evil in and of itself. It's just the fire that comes from a dragon. It's just fire.
And dragon bad, fire good.
Yeah. And as any Norse story will tell you, fire can be used very well, as a meeting point, as a warming point for food, for comfort, as it's likened to gold, but it can be used for bad as well, like the burning down of the mead hall. So it's not in and of itself a bad or good thing. It's just, it is a thing. And in this case, fire has always been associated with the highest and noblest powers, the fire of the Holy Spirit, the divine fire, the eternal fire of the Eucharistic flame. So that the image of fire is something which has been around in our imagination, associated with very divine, the sun, the divine fire of the sun. I guess you could do a whole a whole essay on images of the sun and fire in Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, because it comes up repeatedly in the stories.
Right. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that's true. And, according to the oldest accounts, not what modern archaeologists say, but like the oldest records that we have, is that the first worship was the worship of fire. Like the first thing that man worshipped was fire. There was something came down, like a meteor came down and it lit a tree, hit a tree or something. It was burning. And so Nimrod said, "Oh, we're gonna the sacred fire, we're gonna worship it." Nimrod did a lot of things, evidently. So, not only a mighty hunter.
Well, he was a mighty hunter. He's just a Nimrod. But the other thing that really mystifies me about that scene too, and I still have no explanation for this, is why does Gollum bite off the finger of Frodo? Now I know people say, well, because he had the ring on it, but why do you have the ring on the finger? Normally he keeps it on a chain around his neck. And he had it on because he was claiming the kingship, the lordship. He was the Dark Lord at that moment, and it made him invisible. But the thing that really is, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this, is that there's been this huge debate over which finger. Was it this finger, or was it this finger, or was it even the middle one? Some people have it here on this finger here, which is the one that allegedly was the finger that commanded and distinguished things. Because all the fingers originally, as the hand, all had symbolic importance. And this finger here, as the marriage ring finger, was allegedly had a vein that ran all the way to the heart. So that when you put the ring on this finger, it was because it was directly to the heart, and you would say, I wed you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and put it on this ring. I mystified my own wife when I did that. She didn't know what the hell I was doing when I didn't tell her I was going to do this old practice. And so when I go to marry her, I'm like, I'll marry you in the name of the Father, and she's like sticking out her finger, like, it's this one. Put it there.
This one, don't screw it up.
But if, for instance, if Frodo has the ring on this finger and
Mm-hmm.
Gollum bites off this finger, is there supposed to be the echo of a marriage contract going on? And I don't mean a marriage between Frodo and Gollum. That, I mean, it's certainly not. Put the sexuality thing aside from it, because it's not at all what we're talking about here. Is there a marriage between Frodo and Gollum in that the dark side and the light side of the personality become one, so to speak? You know, like,
Mm-hmm.
what is it that Freud talks about, the animus and the anima, or whatever it is, the dark
Mm-hmm.
and the light side of the soul? Is that what's going on here? That the two are melding together, and then that dark side of the soul is thrown into the purging fire and abandoned for a sort of transcendental, I don't know what you would call it, enlightenment on the part of Frodo. Or
Right.
is it possible that it's Gollum taking the place of the bridegroom to marry with these primordial powers, so that Frodo doesn't have to, or because Frodo can't do so? And I
Right.
don't have an answer to any of these things. It's an interesting image to me.
As Bilbo said at the very beginning, all of them at once, I suppose.
Maybe. I mean, for instance, if it is Gollum taking the place of Frodo as a bridegroom for this primordial power, as a sacrificial lamb, isn't that exactly what Christ does?
Which
Now, I'm
makes
not saying
it
Gollum's
kind
Christ.
of,
Please, let's not go there. Christ is not Gollum. Gollum is not Christ. Obviously.
however, however, Smeagol is Christ-like in that way. It doesn't make Christ Smeagol-like. However, if we do delve back into the idea of why the word golem, what is a golem, and the other associations with that, that's flesh that's been inscribed with that. So it's the reversal, and it's what man creates to be
Yes.
essentially it's a sentient robot, right? That man imbues with a spirit, goes around and wreaks destruction. Insofar as that is an opposite of the Messiah incarnated, therefore they meet again at the opposite ends. And so the name Golem does actually it's the opposite, and insofar as then he what's the goodness, what's the word? Cancels out isn't quite it, but that it folds back in again together when he, like two ends of a book. You got on this end, Christ, like God meets man, and this end, man's breath meets earth to make a golem. So you've got a golem here who then all of a sudden, instead of doing destruction, takes the thing and sacrifices himself into the fire to take off dark power from Frodo. So he's specifically redeeming, like he's literally redeeming Frodo. He's buying back. He has to fight with the merchant to get the thing, right? He's buying back Frodo by taking the ring from him, by stripping the Sauron-ness, the Dark Lord-ness from Frodo. Because I think you're absolutely right. Frodo becomes the Dark Lord at that moment. I think it's going very, very badly, because he's also got other powers, being elf friend. He's got he's hobbit augmented, and now he's got the ring. It could go very, very bad. And Gollum takes this, and in so doing that, he reconciles his own nature to flip over from the one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. So there's a way in which there is a mirror image of opposites that makes that fitting there, a fitting connection.
Which I think is a perfect medieval image, by the way, because I remember reading this somewhere. The medievals were fascinated by this. The crucifixion of Saint Peter upside down, for instance, or the inversion that Dante has of the Satan in the bottom of hell being flipped over. There's this frequent use of medieval imagery of inverted images.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you said the word, you used the phrase bought back, that he was bought back. That's also another classic image. It probably predates medieval times, but the idea of being bought back as a slave or servant is bought back from somebody else, redeemed.
Exactly.
Redemption.
I mean, that's exactly the language that language is introduced. It's not the first time it's ever used, but we know it in the West. It becomes, to talk about redemption is usually not a commercial. I mean, it is when you're taking a coupon in, but otherwise it's almost exclusively religious connotation in Western speech. because it's introduced in the time of Moses. So in the Torah itself, Yahweh is redeeming Israel through his servant Moses. He's redeeming them out of Egypt. He's buying them out of slavery to bring them into the promised land. Like that's where we get the notion of redemption, that this is a commercial type transaction, a manumission on the part of somebody who comes in and says, I'm going to buy that slave because that's my son. I'm going to buy him out from you so he can be free. That concept is introduced into the idea of salvation in the book of Moses, in Exodus, right? That's where that's really put in.
Yeah, and the buying out there is, to some degree, the plagues of Egypt and the whole, what do they call it, cosmogonical catastrophe that happens that allows them to get, fire, water parting, pillars of fire, wind, all that's cosmogonical imagery of the recreation of a world, which,
exactly. And in many ways, the plagues is like two guys haggling at a souk, right, in this Middle Eastern market. Hashem and Pharaoh, haggling back and forth.
Yeah, I'm looking up right now because you said something that sparked my imagination here. I'm looking up the very names themselves too, because that's where Tolkien does this all the time. He takes a name and he adds information into it. And the meaning, I never thought of this before. The meaning of the name Smeagol comes from at least one Old English word, smea, which means penetrating or creeping into. So he is creeping into goal, whatever goal is. But notice that the connection, Smeagol-lum. The golem and smea are related by that single phrase, goal, Smeagol-lum, golem and Smeagol. That's kind of cool. I never thought of that before. And I have yet to find out, because I'm slow on the draw here, but I've yet to find out whether goal had a relationship to gold itself or geld, and whether or not that he's creeping into that.
I don't know what it has to do with gold, but I think of in Latin is golem, is the gola, and goloso, so golositas is gluttony, what we call gluttony, right? You're glutton. We think about glutting. This is all from the common Indo-European root across the different Indo-European languages, at least. The idea of a cave, a vacuous hole, by extension, desire, yearning for something. These are all part of the common Indo-European root for goal.
So he's creeping into that empty space.
Creeping into holes.
Yeah. But golem itself is like an empty hole space golem thing.
Desiring, and a throat, right? That's, it's, and that's explicitly it's where the name comes from. He's called Golem because he makes this gol throat sound in his throat. That's why they call him Golem. We're told that very explicitly. But why that sound? Because that's also what you do in your throat, which has to do with the throat in the sense of the throat of a underground cave.
Yeah.
Beowulf dives down to the water. When he's searching for Grendel's mother to go fight her. He goes through the goal. This is an old English word. Goal. He goes through the goal of the throat of the cave. Underwater, goes up, and then he's in a air, out of the water in a cave filled with air now, in the real belly of it, right, in the fissure of the earth at that point. Evidently, Deagol has to do with secret or hidden. I am not sure about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is on the Tolkien Gateway thing. They say Deagol.
I always like finding out the things, especially when you have somebody like Tolkien who embeds and names these various images and ideas. They're very illuminating. And I wonder in all this too, and I shy away from the whole Christ figure thing because maybe it was too pummeled into me when I was in school, but I do like the idea of Gollum being redeemed at the end, or Gollum having the chance of redemption. It reminds me of that character in Dante, whose name I forget, who is in purgatory, and he dies in a ditch, and he's always this rascal type guy. but he dies in a ditch calling on the name of Mary, and he's in purgatory, which means he's headed towards heaven. So the implication being this guy who's the worst kind of guy. I mean, Dante's surprised by it. He said, "You were the worst kind of guy." They said, "Yeah, but I called on the name of Mary at the end. No, I longed for salvation at the very end of it, and because of that, he ends up on purgatory."
Yeah, what's
It
his
kind of
name? The
reminds
River
me of that.
Arno. Yeah, he dies on the River Arno.
Yes,
I
on
think
the
about it every
River
time I
Arno,
drive
right,
over.
during a civil war of some kind. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was really
But that
cool because
kind
it's
of
only
thing.
about 45 minutes from here.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Well, in case
yeah.
you have any ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
It's
I'll have to look in further into this name
just Smeagol.
Smeagol.
Smeagol can also just simply mean a burrow. It's an Old English word, Smeagol. Tolkien explains, evidently. Here we go. Tolkien explains in the Guide to the Names of the Lord of the Rings the origin of the name Smeagol in a lemma on the smiles, right? The Hobbiton, after the scouring of the Shire, they used a common English word, but not common nowadays. Smiles, Smials, right? They would decide to, how should they rename the remade Beg and Bagshot Row, which is all torn down, rebuild it. Some people wanted to refer to it as, New Row or something like that. Or that's right, they proposed the idea of better smiles, as a play on words. But what is a smile? A smeal, actually. A smeal is a word peculiar to hobbits, meaning burrow, but it is an Old English word. It is, maybe not Old English, but it's an archaic English word meaning a burrow. So better smeals, the better burrows. And it was a purely Bywater joke to call it Sharky's End. That part, right?
Sharky's End, yeah, right. Yes, right. Yes.
But good Hobbit sense prevailed. They just simply called it New Row. But smeals means burrow, and it says so. Tolkien's explanation of the word smeals is that it's a form of that Old English word Smeagol, which is burrow. It would have evolved to be smeals in modern English. The same element appears in Gollum's real name, Smeagol. So here he says Smeagol. So Tolkien says simply in essentially a footnote to something else, Smeagol is essentially the root of Smeagol's name is burrow, which fits with our etymological analysis originally of something that creeps into a hole.
Yeah, burrows creeps into a hole.
So he's the burrower.
So,
but
am I understanding
how is that
right?
Exactly what every hobbit is.
He's like an everyman.
He is hobbitness. He is. That's exactly it. So he's everyman. This is a hobbit's everyman story.
Everyman, I will go with you and be your guide. Cold hard lands, they bites our hands. How about that? Wow. And am I to understand then that there's a spot in Hobbiton that's named after Gollum then? Smiles?
See, they don't end up taking that name. I wouldn't say it's named after him, but it bears there's an echo and a shimmering, a reflection insofar as etymologically they're the same name. So that when they propose the name Better Smeals, one could just as well say in the original Hobbitish or something, not the common tongue, Better Smeagol's was one of the proposed names. Might assume that maybe Frodo was the one who brought that one forth.
Wow, that's really cool. That's really cool. And yeah. Well, I mean, I'm pretty sold on the idea now that the Gollum isn't just an accident. He's not just
nothing in Tolkien's work is an accident.
Right, exactly. But he's not just a billiard ball either.
Yeah, because the Deus Ex Machina. It's not how Tolkien rolls.
Yeah, and I'm also convinced too that, of course, Tolkien said this, that he was discovering this world as more than inventing it. I'm also convinced too that the names that show up in his work and the names that we have even around us for ordinary things have a much older connection that goes way back that we don't recognize, because when we say things like pen or cup, we don't immediately reckon with the history of these things or how they're connected to some ancient thing. But when you start studying a work like Tolkien and go back to the Silmarillion and start there and then read all the way through, you should start seeing that what we deal with in the present of the Lord of the Rings, has these deep roots linguistically as well as historically. Like we talked about Baron and Luthien, being similar to Thingol and Melian, and therefore Aragorn and Arwen being similar to those characters too.
Mhm.
That they have these deep roots that they don't always take into account, and I think that it's very illuminating, both to the work, but also to our whole new understanding. So
Yeah.
well, this has been a good talk. This has been good. I've enjoyed this,
Yes.
even if it's a little patchwork.
Yeah, that's right. We can dovetail this into
Nevertheless.
the other piece, make it all come
Yes.
together.
Well, in the last one we were cut short very quickly, and I had to, scramble to say, we're done. But do you think we're done?
I think we're done.
Okay, I will concede the point. Have a
Motion
good rest of
passed.
your day, sir, and we'll
too.
finish here and call it quits. So farewell, wherever you fare. The areas receive you at your journey then.
May the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks.
Okay.
Good. Desktop. Oh, headphones. Let's put those in my ears.
Right. Well, I thought we were making progress digitalizing everything. Now put it all, burn the books, put it all up on digital. Last forever.
Still too fast.
Oh.
So, catching Lassiter up on our private little moment, our side chat, after you were taken up.
And
Okay,
ponies and
so-
rain and girls. Yeah. I will gosh, I guess I have to look into all that stuff. Okay. Why am I playing music now? She was okay. So
I'm just a man whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
He's been rendered mute, folks. Look at that. Can you talk, sir? Do you have faith? No, I can't hear you. I need to hear more faith.
hey,
Hey,
am I in? Oh,
look at that.
gosh.
Look at that. He has been restored
give me
in the flesh.
Give me another 40 years, I'll get this stuff down right. I'm gonna drop an EMP blast, everything's gonna be wiped out anyway, so you won't have any documentation to speak of. Yeah, so the Nazgul are in the family of the Numenorians because they are the 9 who get corrupted. And that's right. And
we should cut this. I think I have to go.